Hello, everybody. This is the 10th webinar in the series on research and academic writing. And the topic for today is how to write an effective discussion for your research paper. And the discussion section is, of course, the last section of a research paper. Is often the part where a lot of students end up with fatigue, right? After you've gone through an in-depth literature review, doing the analysis, writing up your findings, and then interpreting your findings in the finding section. Sometimes you can feel a little bit stuck about, not quite knowing what is expected of you to write in the discussion section. And this webinar essentially tries to break down in a few really important steps what you can put in that last section. So let's dive in. So the prompt for this webinar is you're well into writing the analysis of your paper, but you realize that you're also supposed to be writing a concluding discussion section. What the heck is that? And there's a clue over here in this prompt question itself about when you should be thinking about what to put in your discussion section, and that is during the analysis of your paper. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But first, let's talk a little bit about, what is the function or the role of the discussion section in your paper? Aside from being, the sunset portion of your research paper, what function does it serve? So it is the last section, right? And it's important to keep in mind that oftentimes different journals and different academic conventions, disciplinary conventions, will often require you to break up this last section into separate subsections with subheadings. And I think that's usually a good idea because it provides you a little bit of organization, a little specificity in terms of what you want to put into each subsection with its own subheading. Another important function of the discussion is that it should summarize your research findings for the reader. The reader should be left in no doubt that you have answered the research questions that you posed, at the start of your paper. And the summary is really helpful because your finding section generally runs to anything from 5 to 10 pages perhaps, and there's a lot of information and material sort of packed into those pages. And so what you want in the discussion section is to sort of summarize the main parts, the main takeaway points, the key findings of your research for your reader. It should also demonstrate your informed thinking about the broader implications of your work, both the good and the not so good implications, right? And this means recognizing how you're contributing to theory and potential everyday practice, as well as the limitations of your research. What were the potential drawbacks of the methods that you employed or the theories that you utilized? So this is the part where it does require a sort of like, stepping away or stepping out of your the immediate vicinity of your research findings to think about, what is the impact of this going to be? It almost asks you to sort of leave your researcher hat behind and put on your reviewer hat and think about, well, what could this research, what could these findings lead to, for the future? And then finally, your discussion section should leave the reader with a memorable message or last impression of your research paper, because again, this is the sunset portion of the paper. So you want the reader and the reviewer to leave with a memorable message, a good takeaway point or two. So here I've tried to arrange the elements of an effective discussion. And of course, keep in mind over here that how you actually arrange these elements, this content, how you use subheadings or not, really depends on, guidelines that individual journals might outline, and or conventions of individual disciplines. But broadly speaking, I think that, most effective discussion sections have these 5 elements. There's usually a summary paragraph at the start, right? Or 1 or 3 paragraphs, for depending on the breadth and depth of your research findings. And the summary section is supposed to essentially just overview what did you do, how did you do it? So describing your theory and methods, and again describing the key findings of what you found. So essentially packaging it in a digestible pill sort of form for your reader. And then the next 2 subsections, the theoretical implications and the practical implications, as well as I think the limitations subsection, these next 3 subsections, this is where again you're asked to put on your reviewer hat almost, right? And so for the theoretical implications, think about what are the potential, why are these findings really important for research on this topic? How will your findings extend or modify or even challenge prior theorization? What should future research attempt to do to explore these implications further? So these are potential prompts for you to keep in mind for when you are writing this subsection. So this subsection will require you to not only draw from the findings of your analysis, but it will ask you to connect it to the literature review section, to the theory section, and sort of think about, well, what are the broader implications for my findings for this body of literature? And oftentimes, as you can see over here, a lot of really good discussion sections often sort of wed the future research implications into this theoretical implications section. The next subsection, the practical implications subsection, is actually quite similar in terms of thinking about the big picture issue. But this time, the big picture issue tends to be for practice or for social everyday policies or situations, right? So you're asked, so some prompt questions that you might consider when you are writing this subsection is, why are your findings important for the big picture issue in society, right? How will this benefit society in a different way? How will your findings be translated into different applications or policies or strategies for everyday life? So an example might be if you did a research paper on how people are adjusting to workplace environments, office environments, going back to work after the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the part where you think about how the different kinds of policies and practices that organizations and managers could actually implement, in day-to-day situations, maybe potential issues for psychiatrists and therapists to keep in mind. Of course, as mental wellness issues rise in social significance. Maybe some self-help or self-modulation practices that individual workers can practice to better ease their adjustment going back to work. So this is the part where you're really thinking about the big picture issue in society. It's not as connected to theory. Of course, since your findings have been derived and guided by theory, I wouldn't say that there's no connection to theory at all, but the focus is very much on everyday issues, the big picture impact on society and social situations. And then you've got the next subsection, or the limitations subsection, which also often researchers do wed in implications for future research, or the recommendations for what scholars should do in the future if they want to replicate or further extend this kind of study that you just did. So a few prompts for you to think about. for this subsection might be, how might have different research design decisions have influenced the findings? So maybe if someone had used a different sample of participants, had changed the kind of data that they collected, maybe from interviews to survey data, maybe if they used a different kind of data analysis, or use a different theoretical lens, how do you think the research would have changed, the findings would have changed, if at all, right? Or put differently, what do you think were the restraints or the limiting conditions of all of these research design decisions that you made for your individual paper? Right? I will say that for this subsection, it is important to acknowledge the limitations of your research design decisions, but you do not want to, become too negative and downplay your work too much, because at the end of the day, you do want to leave the reader with a positive impression, a positive takeaway of the work that you did. Your work is useful and important, and you want to sort of, at the end, maybe end with a sentence saying, despite these limitations, again, underline the importance of this work. Maybe it's a new context or a new extension of the research, or, a new method that is obviously far from perfect, but it is still important, and you want to emphasize that. And finally, the last subsection of a discussion is the conclusion subsection. And usually this is no more than 1 or 2 paragraphs that essentially, again, sort of distill all of the information that has come before into sort of like this takeaway package, right, for your reader. It is supposed to reiterate and emphasize the importance of your research and its findings, despite the limitations that you've just described before. And again, you want to leave your reader with a memorable parting message, and they should think highly of your research. So again, these are generally the 5 elements of an effective discussion, in my opinion. You may or may not use subheadings depending on journal guidelines or conventions. Sometimes subheadings can be helpful for yourself. I found that for my case. Sometimes if you're working against a word count for a journal, subheadings can add to the word count, and they might be a little problematic, especially in the discussion section. But if you have the content, arranged in this order and sort of aligned to these elements, I think you're gold. This is an alternative way of arranging those 5 elements in the discussion. So for instance, you could start, I still would suggest you start with a summary, because you still want to orient your reader after they've read the long finding section. You want to sort of distill your major findings into a summary. But then after that, potentially, you might decide you want to sort of, combine your theoretical and practical implications together in a single implication subsection, right? And then after that, you might decide to focus on the limitations of your research. You might decide to have a separate subsection entirely of future research, as opposed to the previous method that I showed you, where the future research part was sort of wedded into the theoretical implications and the limitations subsections. So you might consider, for instance, in a separate future research subsection, how the different implications of the findings may be pursued in subsequent new research projects. How might different methods be utilized? What impacts might they have? So, and I'm sure you can think of some additional questions and answers to these questions, because you do have to sort of pose meaningful, intelligent answers for these question prompts, and then finally end with a conclusion. So that's pretty much all, folks, and a few main takeaways. So first, in terms of length, I get this question a lot: how long should the discussion section be? I do think it should be at least around 3 to 5 pages. It should be pretty well developed. Because I think one cardinal mistake, again, that a lot of students sometimes make is that after you're done with the analysis of the finding section, you think you're done with the paper. But unless you sort of, again, discuss what are the broader implications of your research, the limitations of your research, and summarize those findings again for your reader, it doesn't quite do your work justice. So 3 to 5 pages would be helpful. A procedural tip I would suggest, and this sort of goes back to what I mentioned earlier about when you should start sort of working on your discussion section. And I always start working on my discussion section, or at least taking down notes for the discussion section during my analysis or findings of the findings itself, because that's when I start jotting down notes about findings that are interesting or surprising, that challenge the status quo, that are different from prior research or deepen the findings of prior research, which, and this is exactly the sort of thing that you want to highlight in your theoretical implications. Or maybe if you've had a light bulb moment, oh, you know what, these findings could be employed in this way by practitioners or policymakers. Again, you want to jot that note down because that's going to be really helpful for your discussion section. So you want to jot those notes down so that you can elaborate on them later in this discussion section. A warning, I think, is due over here. Even as you're talking about the theoretical implications of your findings, for the body of literature that you're drawing from, this discussion section is not the place where you want to introduce new theoretical concepts, right? If your findings do point an extension towards an existing theoretical concept, then you should make sure that you've talked about that theoretical concept at length in your literature review section or your theory section earlier on in the paper. And so in the discussion section, you're only sort of, doing a callback. You're referring back to X concept that you described earlier in the paper, and then pointing out over here about how your findings are potentially extending or challenging or contributing to that concept X. So keep that in mind. I also think it's important to be creative and thoughtful when it comes to thinking about your implications, your theoretical and practical implications, your limitations and future research possibilities. In many ways, I think the discussion section is really the place where, your personality, your background, your experience really gets a moment to shine, because you get to think in a very deep and reflective manner about what the implications of your research can be. And then finally, I'll leave you with this parting message, and that is to be confident in your parting message, right? Yes, there are limitations of your research. No research is perfect, but you want to emphasize that your research is still important, right? The contribution that you are making to the body of literature or to society in general is still meaningful and impactful. And you want to be confident in your parting messages, right? So confirm for the reader that the time that they spent, that they invested in reading your paper was actually time well spent for them. So that's it for me. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great paper.